In fact, at first, we didn't even know if investigative genetic genealogy, meaning working with law enforcement, was going to be allowed.
That's the voice of pioneering genetic genealogist Cece Moore. I was lucky enough to find myself in Austin, Texas at the same time Moore was back in January, and even luckier when she agreed to speak with me the same evening we got into town. To better understand the timing of Moore's involvement in the Brashier case, we first talked about the major shift in her industry that made it happen. When genetic genealogy came to the forefront, it focused on family history or finding a biological parent. But Moore wanted to do more.
I actually went to 23andMe back in 2012 to ask them if they would allow a homicide to be uploaded to their database to do exactly this.
See if anybody out there.
And they said no. Then I asked Ancestry when they came online. They said no. Then I asked my Heritage CEO. He said no.
So Cece Moore began working quietly with DNA tech company Parabon Nanolabs, which later hired her as their chief genetic genealogist. The challenge at the time, getting the forensic DNA used by law enforcement into the right format and the right databases to do genetic genealogy on it. That initial behind-the-scenes work involved a raw data repository called GEDmatch, which allowed genetic genealogists to do cross-company DNA comparisons. That means if you used 23andMe to test your DNA and I used Ancestry, we could both upload the genetic raw data file to GEDmatch and see if there's a connection.
There were multiple people that were trying to use GEDmatch to solve cold cases at that time. There was Parabon and I, and then there was Margaret Press from DNA Doe Project, and then Barbara Ray Venter was working with the FBI on the Golden State Killer case. So there was a lot kind of going on behind the scenes.
In 2017?
2017 to 2018.
And then in April 2018, Golden State Killer Joseph DeAngelo Jr. was identified through investigative genetic genealogy, and her field changed overnight.
And so that's the day, it was actually DNA Day, April 25th, 2018, that genetic genealogy changed forever, because suddenly everybody was interested in it and nobody was laughing at us anymore.
Parabon and Moore officially joined forces 1 week later and started offering their services to law enforcement. That same month, investigators from Missouri, South Carolina, and Tennessee approached Parabon about trying to identify an unknown serial killer.
What was it about this case that it looked like it was going to move quickly for you?
Well, it was a white guy, to be blunt.
Mm-hmm.
The largest proportion of the GEDmatch database is people with Northwest European ancestry, so white people with deep roots in the United States. And then when I saw the match list, he had people sharing a lot of DNA with him. And that database wasn't even 1 million people at that time. So you don't expect to see that.
So Moore let law enforcement know their unknown DNA case was worth spending the money on and got to work.
The matches were not as straightforward as they looked, mainly because there were some people related to him twice. So normally you assume all of that DNA is from one relationship. So if you share 6% of your DNA, then you're probably first cousins once removed or half first cousins. But you can also be double second cousins. So that's what happened in his case. And so it wasn't as optimal as some of my cases where I can zero right in and say it's got to be this guy or his siblings. In this case, it's this guy or a bunch of cousins. So I started looking through each of those cousins and researching them.
One of those cousins was Robert Eugene Brashiers, a long-dead career criminal with an attempted murder conviction on his record. Cece Moore found an article online detailing the St. Lucie County, Florida attack back in 1985.
Okay, this guy is capable of violent crime. And then I started following him around the country. But I initially could not tie him to South Carolina, and he was still supposed to be in prison in Florida in April 1990.
Well, you're supposed to be.
Yes.
Yeah.
The confusion came after Moore found an online record indicating Brashiers did not get out of prison in Florida until October 1990. But as you learned in Chapter 1 of this podcast, Brashiers served just 3.5 years of that 12-year sentence and was back out in May 1989. Moore kept digging.
But then I found him over here close enough to, the Missouri case and Tennessee. He's in the right place at the right time over here. We know he has violent tendencies. Mm-hmm. And then I just kept digging and found a Greenville, South Carolina address that was 0.7 miles from Genevieve's apartment, the crime scene. I thought that can't be a coincidence.
Then Cece Moore remembered finding the Facebook page of Robert Brashier's youngest daughter, Deborah.
There was a picture. It didn't say who it was.
Right.
But immediately jumped out at me that he looked just like some of the witness descriptions.
Composites, yeah.
And his hat and his glasses looked exactly like the witness composite, or the sketches that were drawn. And so I thought right away, that must be her father, Robert. I knew she was the daughter of Robert. That's why I was looking at her Facebook page. Mm-hmm. And that really convinced me.
Moore wrote up her report, which included a timeline she built of Robert Brashier's whereabouts and that Facebook photo, and presented it to authorities from that multi-state team. It was August 22nd, 2018. Here's how the New Madrid County Sheriff at the time, Terry Stevens, and Sergeant Bud Cooper both felt when they saw that picture taken from Deborah Brashier's Facebook page.
My first reaction was, wow, he really looks a lot like the composites that we have.
My initial thoughts were I wanted to see how tall he was and how much he weighed.
Cece Moore also remembered having a bad feeling about Robert Brashiers, and she made sure those investigators knew it.
In fact, that was one of the things I really emphasized in my briefing with them when I first introduced them to Robert Brashiers, was you guys need to get this out there because there's going to be other crimes. I just felt it in my bones.
That feeling about Robert Brashiers had to be proven. But you'll remember the career criminal chose to kill himself back in 1999, rather than allow Kennett, Missouri police to arrest him over a stolen license plate. So investigators on the Shear case headed to Alabama to meet with Brashier's wife, Rose, and his youngest daughter, Deborah. Deborah Brashiers described what Bud Cooper said to her on that first visit, the first time I interviewed her back in January 2019.
He said, I'm here from Missouri State Police. I said, you're here about my father. They said, how do you know? I said, because you're from Missouri and that's where he killed himself at, and I have a feeling that there's something wrong.
Deborah remembered them telling her they were investigating a series of cold case rapes and murders. She found herself eager to help.
Was there any hesitation at all?
No.
When they said, can we have a DNA sample?
They had never even asked me. I asked them. I'm like, do you want one? They're like, yes, we have the kit and everything in the car. I'm like, I'll give you one right now.
You're going to hear much more from Deborah Brashiers in a later chapter of this podcast. For now, I will tell you Missouri investigators were grateful for her cooperation. And as Sergeant Bud Cooper told me, it did not take long for Deborah's DNA to verify Cece Moore's work.
Within a matter of days, we knew that was the right person.
But that was not quite good enough, as Sheriff Terry Stevens pointed out.
We wanted 100% probability that we had the right guy.
Good morning, I'm Lieutenant Phil Gregory.
On October 5th, 2018, we learned exactly what investigators did to prove once and for all that Robert Eugene Brashiers was their killer. Master Sergeant Bud Cooper laid it all out during the Southeast Missouri News Conference announcing the Shear case had been solved.
On September 27th in 2018, Brashier's remains were exhumed pursuant to a court order. Additional DNA samples were collected and laboratory testing confirmed Brashier's DNA matched the suspect DNA in all the above-mentioned cases.
That sound you hear comes from a backhoe, as it raised Robert Brashier's vault out of the ground in Paragould, Arkansas. And when investigators exhumed Brashier's, they did not take just a few DNA samples. They took several. That decision would come into play years later when Robert Brashier's victim count jumped from 3 to 8.
At this time, we'll entertain a few questions.
As Lieutenant Phil Gregory opened the floor to media questions, I asked how investigators felt when they learned Robert Brashier had killed himself less than a year after the Shear murders.
Phil, how tough was it, after all these years, to find out that he had been dead as long as he had?
We as investigators always want to get the complete answer, so it certainly takes that away from us that we don't have the opportunity to ask him questions and get the rest of the story, if you will, from him.
I also asked about Brashier's arrest in Paragould, Arkansas in April of 1998, when he tried to break into his neighbor's house with a gun and a video camera. It happened just 2 weeks after Sherry and Megan were killed. You'll hear Sheriff Terry Stevens answering.
He was that close and in police custody. Is there any explanation as to how those pieces did not get put together in '98?
The only thing that I can say is sometimes things slip through the cracks. Our level of communication is a lot greater now than it was 20 years ago. The technology that's available to us is a lot more advanced than it was 20 years ago. I can't point my finger and say there's any specific reason why the pieces wasn't put together.
The news conference ended with handshakes and hugs. Stephen Shear was there, accepting both from friends, neighbors, and law enforcement.
We're done. We got the right guy.
I interviewed Bud Cooper one last time about the Shear case a few months after he played such a huge role in solving it. Cooper didn't want to talk about himself or what the case meant to him. Instead, he wanted to talk about telling Sherry Shear's husband they had finally found his wife and daughter's killer.
I think he was relieved that we finally figured it out. Somewhat relieved that he knew he and his son were not going to have to go through the whole trial process, and appreciative that we had stayed on it. It was a good one to solve for everybody.
Robert Brashier's name quickly faded from the spotlight after that good solve. But the investigators who tracked Brashier's for 2 decades knew he had more victims out there. Here's retired Highway Patrol Captain Phil Gregory.
Based on his track record, it appears if he's out of jail, he is assaulting people or killing people. So there would have likely been other crimes.
And those crimes could be anywhere. Here's how former Sheriff Terry Stevens and current Porterville Police Chief Freddie Hill explained the difficulty in tracking Brashier's.
He didn't have a certain particular, so to speak, hunting area. He was mobile, on the move. You know, he done Dyersburg right after the Shear homicides, but I think that was just an opportunity. He was getting away from us, and he seen the opportunity and tried to take advantage of it. But other than that, he traveled so far and so wide and so various locations.
Yeah, he didn't stay in one place very long. He kept on the move.
That's why retired Highway Patrol Master Sergeant Jeff Heath believes technology will be the key to uncovering other victims.
I believe there are more cases that time will tell whether we'll find them or match them. You know, with all the cold cases got going, I know the Attorney General's office here in the state of Missouri, they started a cold case in the last few years, if you will. We're not the only state. There are big metropolitan areas that work cold cases now. So with the DNA and the advancements, and I believe, yes, they will find more. I think there's more out there, and I think they will find more.
And Bud Cooper thought so too. In fact, 1 year before the Shear case was solved, after they had just learned about the Memphis link, Cooper and I talked about what else their killer might have done.
Does it leave you wondering what he did between 1990 and 1997?
Absolutely. And I think that there are still departments testing evidence, and it would not surprise me that we get another hit.
But I'm not sure anyone expected the next big DNA hit involving Robert Brashiers to connect him to one of the most well-known multiple murder cases in the country.
As all of you know, the Austin police have announced that a significant breakthrough has been made in the yogurt shop murder case.
Robert Brashiers, the serial killer no one had really heard of before, had been linked through DNA and a shell casing to the 1991 shooting deaths of 4 Texas teenagers, known as the yogurt shop murders. Austin's mayor told his city they could finally breathe a sigh of relief. They would have some closure. But for the family of the yogurt shop's youngest victim, learning about Robert Brashiers has made an already horrifying situation even worse.
When they said serial killer, it's disgusting. It makes, I mean, just like Sean said, it changed the whole thought process of it could have really just been an accident. It could have just been something that had gone off the wheels and it shouldn't have gone that far, to he deliberately went in there and he did that. And there was no chance for those girls. And then now we're stuck with this spawn of the devil. It's just a sick feeling.
That's next in Chapter 5 of Chasing a Ghost, The Yogurt Shop Suspect.